When you're sleeping, you're at your most vulnerable. Imagine discovering that the person who's been lying next to you for years has been slowly poisoning your body. This was my reality for 7 years. Good afternoon, my dears. My name is Eleanor Miller, and I'm 83 years old. Today, I'm going to share a story I've kept silent for decades. But before I begin, I'd like to ask you to please leave a like on this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. It helps me tremendously to know who's on the other side listening to my story. I was born in 1942 in a small town in Kentucky called Pine Ridge. We were a simple family. My father worked in the coal mines, and my mother took care of me and my 5 siblings. In those days, girls didn't have many choices in life. I only studied until 4th grade. After that, I had to help at home while my brothers continued their education. At 19, I met Gerald at a church social. He was a handsome, hard-working man with a stable job at the textile factory, which was the pride of our region. Everyone said I'd struck gold when he started courting me. Back then, respectable girls didn't date for long. Within 6 months, we were engaged, and before I turned 20, we were married. Our house was small but tidy. It was near the factory where Gerald worked, a blue 2-story house with white windows. I remember it like it was yesterday. I planted flowers in the front yard and embroidered tablecloths. I prepared lunch for him to take every day. For the first 3 years, we lived the life every young woman dreamed of. He would go to work. I would take care of the house, visit my mother on Sundays after church, and we dreamed about the children we'd have. But God didn't send us children. At first we were sad, but Gerald said this way we could enjoy each other more. It was around 1965, after 3 years of marriage, when things started to change. Gerald got promoted at the factory and began working directly with the owner, Mr. Mendoza. With that came overtime, business dinners, trips to Chicago to buy materials. I missed him, but I was proud. My husband was moving up in the world, while my friends' husbands stayed in the same position. It was during this period that I started feeling the first pains. At first, they were small discomforts. I'd wake up with joint pain in my fingers, as if I'd spent the night tightly gripping something. Then came the leg pains, a burning sensation in my muscles. I thought it was fatigue. After all, the house was big, and I did everything myself. When I mentioned it to Gerald, he suggested I visit Dr. Paul, the town doctor. That was the first of many, many consultations that would become part of my life for the next 7 years. Dr. Paul examined me, said it wasn't anything serious, prescribed some pain pills, and sent me home. I took the medicine, but the pains didn't go away. In fact, as the weeks passed, they got worse. I went back to Dr. Paul 3 times that year. With each visit, he seemed more impatient with me. "Mrs. Miller, you need to occupy yourself more. Find something to distract your mind," he would say, as if I was making it all up. But I felt it. My God, how I felt it. It was a pain that started in my joints, then spread through my muscles. Some mornings I could barely get out of bed. In 1967, the pains became so intense that Gerald took me to a specialist in Louisville. We spent almost all our savings on tests, x-rays, blood work. The diagnosis, neurasthenia with psychosomatic manifestations. In simple words, the doctor was saying it was all in my head. "Your wife needs mental rest," he told Gerald, as if I wasn't in the same room. "I recommend a mild sedative before bed and vitamins to strengthen the nervous system." We returned home with a suitcase full of medications, sedatives, vitamins, painkillers. I took everything religiously, hoping some of it would work. Gerald started giving me the sedative every night with a glass of warm milk. "To help you sleep better, dear," he would say. And I believed him. How could I not believe the man who had promised to care for me in sickness and in health? The years went by and my pains only increased. It wasn't just in the morning anymore, it was all day. My hair started falling out, my nails became weak and brittle. I lost so much weight that my clothes seemed to belong to someone else. The neighbors started gossiping. They said I had the bad disease. Back then, people were even afraid to say the word cancer. Gerald seemed increasingly distant. The overtime increased. Sometimes he came home so late that I was already asleep, drugged by the sedatives. When I asked about work, his answers were short, irritated. "You wouldn't understand, Eleanor. It's men's business." In 1969, I made a promise to God. I lit candles for days in a row. I fasted on Fridays and prayed the rosary every night. I asked him to show me the cause of my pains or to take away my suffering. I've always had great faith, you know. I believed God doesn't give us a burden heavier than we can carry. It was that same year that Mrs. Clark moved into the house next to ours. She was different from the other women in the neighborhood. She had been a teacher in Louisville, was a widow, lived alone, and didn't care what others thought. She wore pants when other women only wore dresses, drove her own car, and smoked cigarettes on the porch while reading books. At first, the neighbors spoke poorly of her, saying she wasn't an example of a decent woman. But I was so lonely, so desperate for someone who wouldn't look at me with pity or suspicion, that I started visiting her in the afternoons when Gerald was at work. Mrs. Clark listened to me, really listened, without interrupting, without judging. She was the first person who didn't doubt my pains, who didn't suggest it was all in my head. On the contrary, she asked questions, took notes on my answers, and seemed genuinely interested in solving the mystery. "Eleanor," she asked me one day, "have you noticed any pattern in your pains? Do they get worse at any specific time or after eating something?" No one had ever asked me that before. I started paying more attention, making notes like Mrs. Clark suggested, and that's how I noticed. The pains were always worse on the mornings after Gerald came home late from work. On days when he arrived at the normal time, I woke up feeling better. I could at least get up without as much suffering. When I mentioned this to Mrs. Clark, I saw something pass through her eyes, a shadow of concern, perhaps even fear. She invited me inside, closed the living room curtains as if afraid someone might see us talking, and sat down close to me. "Eleanor, forgive me for asking, but do you completely trust your husband?" I was shocked. How could she suggest such a thing? Gerald might be distant, yes, tired from work, irritated with my illness that never went away, but to think that he wasn't impossible. "Mrs. Clark, Gerald may have his flaws, but he's a good man. He takes me to doctors, pays for the medicines, takes care of me." She didn't insist, but she didn't seem convinced either. Before I left, she held my hands in hers and said something that would change my life forever. "Tomorrow, don't take the sedative he gives you. Pretend you took it. Hide the pill, lie down, and pretend to sleep. See what happens." I went home disturbed. How could Mrs. Clark suggest something like that? It was crazy. It was. And yet, the seed of doubt was planted. That night, when Gerald brought me the sedative with the milk, I observed him with different eyes. Was there something in his gesture, a kind of disguised anxiety I had never noticed before? Or was Mrs. Clark's suspicion affecting my judgment? I took the medicine as always, but the following night I gathered all my courage. When Gerald brought me the glass of milk with the pill, I brought it to my mouth but didn't swallow. I hid the pill in my closed hand, drank the milk, and wished my husband good night. I lay down with my back to him, my heart beating so hard I was afraid he might hear it. When I noticed Gerald was breathing deeply, I got up silently and went to the bathroom. I threw the pill in the toilet. I returned to bed and pretended to sleep, but stayed alert with my eyes half closed. Around midnight, I felt Gerald moving beside me. He got up carefully, watched to see if I was really sleeping, and then left the room. I heard his steps going down the stairs, heading toward the kitchen. What could he be doing? I got up silently and followed him, keeping to the shadows. Through the crack in the kitchen door, I saw something I'll never forget as long as I live. Gerald was standing by the cabinet where we kept the cleaning products. He took out a small bottle without a label and with great care dropped a few drops into a cup, the same blue cup I used every morning for my coffee. I retreated in horror, trying not to make noise. I went up the stairs as silently as possible. I returned to bed and covered myself, trembling, not from pain, but from fear. What was in that bottle? What was Gerald putting in my food? Could it be possible that the man with whom I had shared my life for 7 years was poisoning me? The night was long. I pretended to sleep when Gerald returned to bed. The next morning, when he left for work, I ran to Mrs. Clark's house. I told her what I had seen, tears streaming down my face. She didn't seem surprised, just deeply sad. "We need proof, Eleanor, something we can show to the authorities." It was then that Mrs. Clark told me about her son, who lived in the city. He was an amateur photographer. He had a modern camera that could take photos even in low light. She called him, explained the situation without going into details, and 2 days later he appeared with the equipment. George, Mrs. Clark's son, taught me how to use the camera. It was a strange object for me, heavy and complicated, but I understood the basics. We positioned the equipment on top of the kitchen cabinet, hidden by a plant, pointed directly at the countertop where the cups were kept. That night, I didn't take the sedative again. I spent hours awake, listening to every creak in the house, every sigh from Gerald. And again, around midnight, he got up and went down to the kitchen. I heard the familiar sounds, the cabinet door opening, the clinking of the cup. After a few minutes, he returned to bed. The next morning, as soon as Gerald left, I rushed to check the camera. The film had ended exactly as George had explained it would. I carefully saved the roll and took it to Mrs. Clark. She said George would return on the weekend to develop the photos in an improvised lab at her house. Those 3 days of waiting were the longest of my life. I continued pretending to take the sedatives, pretending nothing had changed, while inside I was dying a little each time Gerald kissed me in the morning before leaving for work. When George finally developed the photos, the truth was there in black and white, impossible to deny. Gerald, my husband, the man who had sworn to love and protect me, was putting something in my cup. In one of the photos, you could clearly see the bottle in his hand, the drops falling into the liquid. Mrs. Clark suggested we take the photos to a pharmacist friend in Louisville, someone trustworthy who could help us identify what that substance might be without alerting Gerald. I agreed, desperate for answers. Mr. Mendez, the pharmacist, examined the photos with a magnifying glass. After much analysis, he told us that, judging by the shape of the bottle and my symptoms, it could be some kind of diluted rat poison, not enough to kill at once, but sufficient to slowly deteriorate the body, causing chronic pain and progressive weakening. If you continued consuming this for a few more years, he told me, you would probably experience kidney or liver failure. It would be a seemingly natural death, without raising suspicions. I left Mr. Mendez's pharmacy with weak legs, needing to lean on Mrs. Clark to avoid falling. Poisoning. My own husband was slowly poisoning me day after day for years. The pain I felt at that moment wasn't physical. It was a wound in my soul that seemed bottomless. Why? It was the only question hammering in my mind. Why would Gerald do this to me? I had been a good wife. I kept the house immaculate. I never complained when he came home late. I took care of his clothes. I prepared his favorite meals, even on days when I could barely stand because of the pain. What reason could he have for wanting to watch me die slowly? We returned to our town the same day. Throughout the entire bus ride back, I looked out the window without really seeing the landscape. I felt like I was in a nightmare, one of those you try to wake up from but can't. Mrs. Clark held my hand. Sometimes she would say something I couldn't process. The world had lost its meaning. When we arrived, it was already night. Gerald would be at home waiting for me, probably with a sedative and glass of milk ready. The idea of facing those eyes, of pretending everything was normal, made me nauseous. Mrs. Clark noticed my despair. "You don't have to go back home now," she said. "You can stay with me until we decide what to do." I accepted without hesitation. We sent a message to Gerald through the neighbor's son, saying I had become ill in Louisville and would need to stay hospitalized for a few days. It wasn't a complete lie. I really was sick, just not in the way he thought. For 3 days, I hid in Mrs. Clark's house, drinking liters of water trying to cleanse my body of that poison. Gradually, my mind started functioning again, connecting the dots. Gerald's overtime, the growing irritation, the distancing. There was something else happening, something I wasn't seeing. It was George who suggested we follow Gerald. "If he's trying to get rid of you," he said, "there must be a reason beyond money, since you're not rich." Usually in these cases, there's someone else involved. Another woman. The possibility had never seriously crossed my mind. Gerald was reserved, sometimes distant, but I never thought he might be cheating on me. Jealousy was never part of our marriage because I trusted him blindly from the first day. George offered to follow Gerald after work. Since he wasn't from town, there was no risk of being recognized. I wanted to go along, to see with my own eyes, but they convinced me it was too risky. That same night, George took his car and parked near the factory. When the shift ended, he saw Gerald leave, not alone as I expected, but accompanied by a woman. They got into Gerald's car and headed for the road leading to the next town. George followed at a safe distance. They stopped in front of a large house, one of those belonging to wealthy people. The woman got out first, Gerald right behind her. They entered the house hand in hand, without bothering to look around. They didn't act like people afraid of being discovered, but like a couple that felt safe, comfortable with each other. George waited for almost 2 hours. Gerald didn't come out. When he returned and told me everything, with Mrs. Clark by my side, something inside me broke. The last thread of hope, the one that said maybe there was an explanation, that maybe it was all a terrible mistake. There was no mistake. There was only betrayal, in the cruelest possible way. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely coming out. George hesitated, looked at his mother as if asking permission. "From what I could find out by asking around," he finally said, "it's Helena Mendoza, the sister-in-law of the factory owner. She became a widow 3 years ago when Mr. Mendoza's brother died in a car accident. She inherited everything, the house, the investments, even part of the factory shares. Helena Mendoza. I knew her by sight from Sunday masses and town events. An elegant, sophisticated woman, about 10 years older than me. The kind of woman who seemed to belong to another world. Fine clothes, jewelry, hands that had never washed a pot, the opposite of me with my short nails, rough hands from housework, simple dresses I made myself. And now? I asked, more to myself than to them. What do I do with this information? It was Mrs. Clark who responded, with that firmness I so admired. Now you decide whether you want to confront your husband or go directly to the police with the evidence we have. The police. Until that moment, I hadn't really considered involving the authorities. In my mind, I was still dealing with a marriage problem, not a crime. But it was exactly that, a crime. Gerald was trying to kill me. "If we go to the police," argued George, "we need to be sure the evidence is sufficient. Photos of someone dropping something into a cup might not be enough. He could say it was medicine, vitamins, anything." He was right. We needed more. And so, against all my self-preservation instincts, I decided I would go back home, confront Gerald, somehow record his confession, and then be free of him forever. Mrs. Clark and George tried to dissuade me. It was too dangerous, they said. What if Gerald realized I knew? What if he tried something more drastic to silence me? But my mind was made up. 7 years of pain, of humiliation, of being treated like I was crazy when in fact I was being poisoned. It had to end. And I needed to look into the eyes of the man who had destroyed my health and my trust. George lent me a small tape recorder, the kind reporters use. He showed me how it worked, how to hide it in the pocket of my apron. The plan was simple. I would return home saying I'd been discharged from the hospital, act normally, and at the right moment, confront Gerald with what I knew. I returned home on a Friday afternoon. Gerald wasn't there. Friday was overtime day. I now understood what that meant. I took advantage to search the house, looking for the poison. I found the bottle hidden at the back of the kitchen cabinet behind the cans of food. It had no label, just a colorless liquid that looked like water. I didn't dare open it to smell. I put it back exactly where it was. I prepared dinner like I did every Friday. Rice, beans, steak with onions. His favorite food. I set the table, took a long shower, put on a clean nightgown. It would be the last night I would sleep under the same roof as that man. This certainty gave me a strength I didn't know I had. Gerald arrived after 9, smelling of expensive cologne. He seemed surprised to see me standing in the kitchen, apparently recovered. "Eleanor, I didn't expect to find you at home." His voice tried to sound casual, but there was something strange in it. Perhaps concern, perhaps fear. "The doctor said it wasn't anything serious," I replied, forcing a smile. "They gave me some stronger medicine and sent me home. I prepared your favorite dinner." Gerald seemed uncomfortable, as if he didn't know what to do with this new version of me. Smiling, apparently healthy. During dinner, we talked about trivial things. He avoided looking directly into my eyes, perhaps fearing what he might see reflected in them. After dinner, he said he was going to take a shower. I heard the shower running and took the opportunity to turn on the recorder in the pocket of my apron. My heart was beating so hard I feared it might be heard on the recording. When Gerald returned to the kitchen, I was sitting at the table, the unlabeled bottle in front of me. The color drained from his face. His eyes went from the bottle to me, wide like those of a cornered animal. "What is this?" I asked calmly, though inside I was screaming. "Why do you keep rat poison in our food cabinet, Gerald?" I don't know what you're talking about," he stuttered, trying to appear indignant. "That must be some cleaning product. Don't mess with household things you don't understand." "I understand enough to know you've been putting this in my coffee every morning. I understand that these drops have been causing me pain for 7 years. I understand that you're trying to kill me, Gerald. What I don't understand is why." He tried to deny it, of course. He said I was crazy, that the doctors were right about my neurasthenia, that I was making things up, but I didn't back down. I placed the photos on the table, one by one, Gerald dropping the liquid into my cup night after night. The evidence was irrefutable. For long minutes, he stood in silence, looking at the photos. Then something changed in his face. The mask fell. I saw for the first time the real Gerald. Cold, calculating, a complete stranger to me. "You weren't going to die," he finally said, his voice strangely calm. "Not immediately. It would appear as a long, wearing illness. No one would suspect." Hearing that direct confession, so devoid of any remorse, made my hands tremble under the table, but I maintained my composure. I needed him to keep talking. "Why, Gerald? What did I do to deserve this?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "It's not about you, Eleanor. It never was. It's about Helena." And then the whole story poured out like poison from his own mouth. Helena and he had been together for almost 4 years, since before her husband's death. They planned to be together, but divorce at that time was practically impossible. Expensive, scandalous. It would mean he'd lose his job at the factory, be rejected by the community. The death of Helena's husband was convenient. It opened a door. Only one obstacle remained: me. "Helena suggested it would be easier if you simply weren't in the way anymore," he said, now speaking freely, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Her brother was a pharmacist. He knew substances that leave no trace. We started with small doses to see how your body would react. The idea was to gradually increase until your system couldn't take it anymore." Every word was a stab. This man with whom I'd shared my bed, my dreams, my youth, had coldly conspired to take my life. And why? To be with a rich woman, to move up in the world, to avoid the scandal of a divorce. And the pain? Did you know how much I suffered? "Of course I knew," he replied, and there was almost a sick pride in his voice. "But it was a necessary evil. The more you complained, the more the doctors believed it was all in your head. When you finally died, everyone would say it was stress, weak nerves, anything but the truth. The recording continued, capturing every word of that monstrous confession. I knew I had enough to take to the police, to ensure Gerald would pay for his crimes. But there was still one question consuming me. Did you ever really love me? Or was it all a lie from the beginning? Gerald seemed to consider the question for a moment, as if he were really making an effort to remember if there had been any real feeling for me. In the beginning, maybe, he finally said. You were pretty, young, would make a good wife, but then I met Helena. She's different, Eleanor. She understands my value, knows what I'm capable of. With her, I can be someone important, not just another factory worker. At that moment, looking at that man I no longer recognized, I felt something strange happen inside me. The fear, the pain, the confusion, all of it began to give way to a cold, controlled anger, a determination I had never felt before. I understand, I said simply, rising from the table. I think we have nothing more to talk about. Gerald looked at me, confused by my calm reaction. He expected tears, hysteria, pleading. He didn't expect this composed woman who was now putting the photos back in her purse. What are you going to do? He finally asked, a tone of concern entering his voice. You're not going to tell anyone, are you? No one would believe you anyway. Everyone thinks you're crazy. We'll see, I replied, walking toward the door. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need fresh air. I walked out the front door without looking back, the recorder still working in the pocket of my apron. I walked straight to Mrs. Clark's house, where George was waiting for me. They listened to the recording in silence, their faces pale with horror. This is more than enough, George said when the tape ended. Let's go to the police station right now. And that's what we did. Sheriff Morells, a serious middle-aged man, attended to us even though it was late at night. He listened to the recording twice, examined the photos carefully, and then looked at me with an expression that mixed compassion and indignation. Mrs. Miller, he said, I've never seen anything like this in all my years in law enforcement. You're lucky to be alive. We're going to arrest your husband right now before he tries to run away or do something worse. 2 hours later, Gerald was behind bars. The news spread through the town like wildfire. The scandal he so feared became even bigger than a simple divorce would have been. Helena Mendoza disappeared from town that same night, leaving behind a closed house and many unanswered questions. In the days following Gerald's arrest, my life turned upside down. You can't imagine what it's like to wake up one morning and discover your entire world was a lie. The marriage I thought was imperfect but real was just a facade for a terrible plan. The man with whom I shared a bed for 7 years had conspired to kill me slowly. It's a type of betrayal that corrodes the soul, that makes you question every memory, every moment you thought was beautiful or special. The entire town was talking about the case. It was the biggest scandal Pine Ridge had ever seen. When I walked down the street, conversations would stop. Eyes would follow me. Some were compassionate, others filled with morbid curiosity, as if I were a circus attraction. There goes the woman whose husband tried to poison her, they whispered. I heard them, even when they pretended I wasn't there. The worst were the malicious comments. She must have done something to deserve it, said some. If she'd been a good wife, her husband wouldn't have needed to look at another woman, the church ladies whispered, as if there were some justification for trying to take someone's life, as if it was my fault for being the victim of such cruelty. Gerald's family was the one that hurt me the most. His parents, who had always treated me like a daughter, completely turned their backs on me. Mr. Anthony, my father-in-law, went so far as to say loudly in the town bar that I had made it all up to get revenge because I discovered Gerald had a mistress, that the photos were forged, that the recording had been manipulated. The pain of betrayal doubled when those I considered family chose to believe the monster instead of the victim. On the other hand, I received support from unexpected places. Mrs. Clark, of course, became my pillar. Without her and George, I might not be here today to tell this story. But there were also other people, neighbors who barely greeted me before now brought food, ladies from the church who organized a campaign to help me financially while the process was ongoing. Dr. Paul, the doctor who for years had said my pains were psychological, came personally to ask for forgiveness. I saw tears in the eyes of that man who had always seemed so cold and distant. "I failed as a doctor and as a human being," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have investigated more. I should have really listened to you." That apology was important, but it didn't erase the years of suffering, the sleepless nights, the wrong diagnoses, the suspicious looks. Nothing could erase that. Still, I accepted his words. Forgiveness, I learned over time, isn't for the other person. It's for ourselves, so we don't carry the weight of resentment. Gerald's trial took place 6 months after his arrest. They were terrible days in court, having to relive every moment of that nightmare, hearing his lawyers trying to discredit my testimony, suggesting I had mental problems, that I had made it all up out of jealousy or revenge. But the evidence was irrefutable. The photos, the recording, the bottle of poison found in our house, the tests that finally confirmed the presence of toxic substances in my body. All of this weighed against him. The testimony of the pharmacist from Louisville was decisive, explaining in detail how the poison worked, how the symptoms corresponded exactly to what I had suffered for years. Helena Mendoza never appeared to testify. They said she had fled abroad, taking with her the fortune of her deceased husband. Other rumors suggested she was hiding on some farm in rural Tennessee, protected by influential relatives. I never knew the truth, and with time, it ceased to matter. She was as guilty as Gerald, but my focus was on healing, not pursuing revenge. Gerald was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted qualified homicide. When they heard the sentence, his parents finally seemed to comprehend the gravity of what their son had done. I saw his mother collapse into her husband's arms, her face contorted in an expression of pain so deep that for a moment I felt sorry for her. They too were victims, in a way. Victims of their own son, of the upbringing they gave him, of the choices he made. With the end of the trial came the inevitable question: what to do now? I was 27 years old, with health debilitated by years of poisoning, without a husband, without a house, which was sold to pay the lawyers, without prospects for the future. Pine Ridge, the town that had been my home for my entire life, now seemed like a prison of curious looks and painful memories. It was Mrs. Clark again who showed me a way. "Come with me to Louisville," she suggested. "I'm going back to teach there. You can stay with me until you get established, start a new life where no one knows your story." The idea of leaving everything behind was both frightening and liberating. What would I do in a big city, without education, without a profession, knowing no one except Mrs. Clark? But the alternative, staying in that town where every corner reminded me of Gerald, where people looked at me with pity or suspicion, seemed even worse. In August 1970, I boarded a bus to Louisville, carrying only 2 suitcases with clothes and a few personal objects I managed to save from the house sale. My mother cried at the bus station. My father stood in silence, holding back tears as men of that generation were taught to do. I promised to visit, to write, to keep in touch. Deep down, we all knew it was a more definitive goodbye than we would have liked to admit. The first months in Louisville were a shock. The noise, the crowds, the fast pace, everything so different from quiet Pine Ridge. I shared a small apartment with Mrs. Clark in the Highlands neighborhood, near the school where she taught. In the first few days, I barely left the house, intimidated by the big city, afraid of getting lost, of being deceived, of facing a world I didn't understand. My health was still fragile. Although the pains had diminished significantly since I stopped being poisoned, years of toxins had left their mark. My digestive system was compromised. My kidneys functioned with difficulty. I had chronic anemia. I needed intensive medical care, this time with doctors who really listened to me, who didn't dismiss my symptoms as imaginary. The treatment was expensive, even with the help of Medicare. The money I received from selling the house was quickly running out. I needed to work. But who would employ a woman with fragile health, with no education beyond elementary school, with no experience in anything except housekeeping. That's when Mrs. Clark introduced me to Mrs. Sullivan, an elderly lady who lived alone in an apartment in the same building. She needed a companion, someone who would cook, administer her medicines, keep her company. The salary wasn't much, but it included a small room at the back of the apartment and all meals. I accepted immediately. Mrs. Sullivan was an angel in my life. A cultured widow who had been a university professor, she had an impressive library and loved to talk about books, politics, art, subjects that had never been part of my life in Pine Ridge. At first, I felt intimidated by her erudition, ashamed of my own ignorance, but she never made me feel inferior. "Intelligence isn't in diplomas, Eleanor," she would tell me. "It's in curiosity, in the desire to learn, in the ability to adapt, and in that, you are rich." Under her guidance, I began to read, first simple books, then more complex works. She taught me new words, patiently corrected my grammar, lent me books she thought I would like. At night, after I finished my chores, we would sit in the living room and she would tell me about the places she had visited, Paris, Rome, London, as if she were taking me along in her memories. It was also Mrs. Sullivan who encouraged me to study formally. "It's never too late to resume your studies," she insisted. At 29, I went back to school, attending night classes to complete middle school. I was the oldest student in the class, surrounded by teenagers, but that didn't intimidate me. Each new lesson was a victory over my past, proof that Gerald had not succeeded in destroying me. In 1973, Mrs. Sullivan suffered a stroke. I did everything I could to help her recover, returning a little of what she had done for me. She survived but was left with the left side of her body partially paralyzed, needing more intensive care. Her daughter, who lived in New York, decided to take her to live with her. I was devastated by the separation, but Mrs. Sullivan made sure to leave me a gift before departing. She paid in advance for a professional sewing course for me. "You have skilled hands and an eye for detail," she said. "You will be an excellent seamstress." The course lasted 6 months. I learned to make patterns, to work with different fabrics, to create custom pieces. I discovered I had a natural talent that I had never explored. In Pine Ridge, I sewed out of necessity, making patches and simple pieces. Now I was creating elegant dresses, well-cut suits, pieces that people admired and for which they were willing to pay well. Upon finishing the course, one of the instructors offered me a job in her atelier downtown. The salary was modest, but tips and commissions made up for it. For the first time in my life, I was earning my own money, doing something that gave me pleasure and recognition. With Mrs. Sullivan's departure, I needed to find a new place to live. I found a small studio apartment in the Germantown neighborhood, a simple but clean place that I could afford with my new salary. It was a space all my own, earned through my work. Feeling the keys in my hand that first day was one of the greatest joys I've ever experienced. Finally, after so much suffering, I was building something solid, something no one could take away from me. The following years were ones of hard work and constant learning. I continued studying at night. I completed high school in 1975. My health gradually improved. The pains still appeared occasionally, but they were shadows of what they had been. The doctors said it was a miracle I hadn't been left with more serious sequelae after years of poisoning. At the atelier, I gained a reputation for meticulousness and punctuality. Clients began to specifically ask for me, to recommend my work to friends. In 1976, the owner of the atelier offered me a partnership. She would contribute the space and the established clientele. I would contribute my work and talent. It was a proposal that changed my life. Spring Atelier. That was the name we chose together. A symbol of the rebirth, the renewal I sought so much. The sign on the door had golden letters on a light green background. Whenever I looked at it, I felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. How had that broken, poisoned, abandoned young woman transformed into the businesswoman I was becoming? It was at the atelier that I met John in 1977. he came to order a suit for his daughter's wedding. A widower for 5 years, he was a simple man who owned a small carpentry shop in the Butchertown neighborhood. He didn't have the sophistication of Mrs. Sullivan or the handsomeness of Gerald when he was young, but he had something infinitely more valuable, a genuine kindness, a transparent honesty in his gaze. Our relationship started slowly, with caution on both sides. I, for obvious reasons, was afraid to trust again. He, out of respect for the memory of his deceased wife, hesitated to move forward. We went out for coffee a few times, then for Sunday lunches, always in public places, always with light conversations. With time, I opened up. I told him about Gerald, about the poisoning, about my escape to Louisville. I expected to see in his eyes what I had seen in so many others: pity, suspicion, or that morbid curiosity. But John just held my hands in his, rough from working with wood, and said, "You are the strongest woman I've ever known, Eleanor." It wasn't a sweeping romance like those in movies or books. It was something quieter, more mature, built on solid foundations of mutual respect and admiration. John courted me in an old-fashioned way. Flowers, little notes left at the atelier, small gifts made by his own hands, a scissor holder carved from wood that I keep to this day, a sewing box with my name engraved on the lid, a footstool for me to rest my feet while working. In 1978, I accepted his marriage proposal. The ceremony was simple, in the neighborhood church, with few guests, friends I had made in Louisville, some of John's relatives, Mrs. Clark and George, who came especially for the occasion. My parents couldn't attend. My father had passed away the year before. My mother was too elderly to travel. At 38, I was starting a new life with a man who valued me for who I was, not for what he could extract from me. A man who knew my past and didn't use it against me, who admired my strength instead of trying to break it. John had his own house, small but cozy, with a yard where he cultivated a garden. I moved there after the wedding but maintained my partnership in the atelier. He never suggested I stop working, never saw my independence as a threat. On the contrary, he took pride in my successes, took friends to visit the atelier, spoke with admiration about my wife, the most sought-after seamstress in the neighborhood. In 1979, at 39, when I had given up on the idea of being a mother, I discovered I was pregnant. It was a surprise for both of us. A wonderful surprise, but also frightening. The doctors warned me about the risks, considering my age and my history of health weakened by poisoning, but I decided to go ahead with all possible precautions. The pregnancy was difficult, with several hospitalizations and absolute rest in the last months. John was by my side at every moment, caring for me with a devotion I had never experienced. In May 1980, our daughter Marianne was born, a miracle of 6 pounds 3 ounces who came into the world determined to live, despite all the odds against her. Looking at that perfect little face, feeling her tiny hands grabbing my finger, was the definitive cure for all the wounds Gerald had left in my soul. I finally understood that I had won. Not just survived, but completely won. I had a job I loved, a husband who respected me, a healthy daughter. I had built a life that years before would have seemed impossible. Marianne brought a completely new light to our lives. In the first years after her birth, I reduced my hours at the atelier to be more present. John adjusted his schedule at the carpentry shop so we could take turns caring for the baby. It wasn't common at that time, the early 80s, to see such a participatory father. The neighbors commented, some with admiration, others with that typical suspicion of those who don't understand what deviates from traditional patterns. A man taking care of a baby? In my time, that didn't exist, said the more conservative ones. But John didn't care about comments. He had lost the chance to see his older daughter grow up because he worked too much and wouldn't make the same mistake with Marianne. Our daughter grew up surrounded by love and an example of partnership. From an early age, she showed a curiosity and intelligence that filled us with pride. By 4, she already knew how to read. By 6, she wrote small stories that John bound in covers carved by himself. At the atelier, she would sit quietly in a corner, drawing dress models that, according to her, modern princesses would wear. In 1985, something happened that shook our little family. I received a letter from Pine Ridge. It was from my younger sister Nancy, with whom I maintained sporadic contact by phone. The letter, written with trembling handwriting and stained with tears, informed me that my mother was very ill. "The doctors say she won't make it past this month," wrote Nancy. "She's asking to see you one last time." 15 years had passed since I left my hometown. 15 years in which I had avoided even thinking about that place, as if I could erase its existence from my memory. I had visited my family a few times, always making them come to Louisville, inventing excuses not to return to Pine Ridge. The idea of seeing those streets again, those people, the house where I was poisoned for years, caused me a dread beyond rational. But now, my mother was dying. How could I deny her this last request? How could I let her go without saying goodbye, without her meeting her granddaughter, without making peace with the past that had separated us? John, as always, was my rock. "We'll go together," he said simply. "You, me, and Marianne. We'll face this as a family." The journey back to Pine Ridge was the most difficult I've ever made in my life. With each mile the bus advanced, I felt my stomach contract, my breathing get shorter. I held John's hand so tightly that my fingers turned white, while Marianne, then 5 years old, slept peacefully on the seat beside me, oblivious to the turmoil agitating her mother. Pine Ridge had changed little since my departure. Some new houses, a renovated square, a TV antenna on the hill, but the essence remained the same. That slow rhythm, that familiarity where everyone knows everyone else's business, that heavy air of untold stories. My mother was staying at Nancy's house, a simple 2-story home on the same street where we grew up. When I entered the room where she was resting, I hardly recognized her. The strong, energetic woman who populated my memories had been transformed into a fragile being, skin and bones, yellowed by the disease consuming her liver. Her eyes, however, lit up when she saw me, and even more when I introduced Marianne, the granddaughter she hadn't met. "How she looks like you when you were a child," she whispered, extending her trembling hand to touch the girl's face. The same curious eyes, the same determined chin. We spent a week in Pine Ridge, intense days where I cared for my mother with my sisters, where Marianne met cousins she didn't know existed, where John charmed everyone with his simplicity and kindness. But they were also difficult days where I had to face looks and whispers when I walked through town. Most people were kind. Many came to greet me, to say they missed me, that they were happy to see me recovered and happy. Others were more direct, asking about that terrible case, wanting to know details about my life after the scandal. Politely but firmly, I deflected those questions. My story belonged to me, not to others' curiosity. On the 5th day of our stay, while shopping at the general store with Marianne, an elderly lady approached. I recognized her immediately, though she was much older, Mrs. Miller, Gerald's mother. My first instinct was to protect Marianne, as if that lady could somehow hurt her. I pulled my daughter close to me, ready to quickly leave the store, but something in Mrs. Miller's look stopped me. There was no hostility there, just a deep sadness, a kind of silent plea. "Eleanor," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "may I speak with you for a moment? Please?" I hesitated. That woman represented a part of my life I had fought so hard to overcome. On the other hand, she too was a victim, the mother of a man who committed a terrible crime, who saw her son imprisoned, her family crumble under the weight of shame. "Marianne, dear," I said to my daughter, "go to the counter and ask Mr. Joseph for a package of those cookies you like. Mommy's going to talk here for a minute." When the girl walked away, I faced Mrs. Miller. What could she want after so many years? "He died," she said simply. "Gerald, in prison 3 years ago. Tuberculosis." The news hit me in a strange way. I didn't feel joy, or satisfied revenge, not even relief. Just a kind of emptiness, as if finally closing a chapter that should have been ended long ago. "I'm sorry for your loss," I replied. And it was true. As monstrous as Gerald had revealed himself to be, he was still the son of that broken woman in front of me. "Before he died," she continued, "he asked me to tell you something if you ever came back to town. He regretted it, Eleanor, not at the beginning, but with time. He said what he did to you was unforgivable, that he understood if you hated him forever." Tears streamed down the wrinkled face of Mrs. Miller. She wasn't just crying for her lost son, but for everything that could have been and wasn't. For all the lives destroyed by terrible choices. "I don't hate your son, Mrs. Miller," I said after a moment of silence. "I don't hate him anymore. Hating would be staying tied to him, to the past. I learned that the best revenge is living well, building a happy life despite everything." At that moment, I realized it was true. The hatred that once consumed my heart had gradually dissipated, replaced by love for my new family, my work, the person I became thanks to the difficulties I faced. Mrs. Miller nodded, wiping away tears with a worn handkerchief. "You were always better than all of us, Eleanor. Always." She looked at Marianne, who was returning with a smile and the package of cookies. "Your daughter is beautiful. She has your eyes." "Thank you," I replied. And then, in an impulse I didn't completely understand myself, I added, "Would you like to meet her? Formally, I mean." I don't know who was more surprised by my invitation, Mrs. Miller or myself, but at that moment I felt it was the right thing to do. Not for Gerald, not for her, but for me, to show myself that I was completely free of the past, that I could face any part of it without fear or resentment. I introduced Marianne as a friend of Mommy's from the old days. The girl, polite as always, extended her small hand, which Mrs. Miller held as if it were a precious jewel. We didn't linger. I said goodbye with a discreet nod and left the store, feeling a weight leave my shoulders. A weight I had carried for so long that I no longer noticed its existence. My mother passed away 3 days later, peacefully, in her sleep. I was beside her, holding her hand, when I felt her breathing grow weaker until it stopped completely. I cried, of course, but it was the calm cry of someone saying goodbye, knowing that everything that needed to be said had been said, that the peace that needed to be made had been made. The funeral was simple, as she would have wanted. The entire town attended. My mother had always been respected in the community, known for her kindness and hard work. Mrs. Miller came too, keeping discreetly to the back of the church. Our eyes met once, a silent understanding passing between us. Forgiveness, not forgetting. Peace, not reconciliation. It was the most we could offer each other. We returned to Louisville the next day. As the bus left Pine Ridge behind, I looked out the window at those streets where I grew up, where I loved, where I suffered, where I almost lost my life. I no longer felt fear or anger, just a strange gratitude for having survived, for having had the strength to start again, for having found a path to happiness when everything seemed lost. The years that followed brought more blessings to our family. In 1987, to our surprise, I discovered I was pregnant again at 45. The doctors were even more cautious this time, considering my advanced age for that era. But Charles was born strong and healthy, completing our family in an unexpected and wonderful way. The atelier was thriving, becoming one of the most respected in Louisville. In 1990, we expanded to a larger space, hiring more seamstresses and also offering courses for young women who wanted to learn the craft. It was my way of giving back everything I had received from Mrs. Sullivan, of passing on the opportunities that transformed my life. John and I celebrated 25 years of marriage in 2003 with a simple party in our backyard, surrounded by friends and family. Marianne, already graduated from law school and working at a law firm focused on women's causes, gave a moving speech about how our love story had shaped her view of relationships and justice. "My parents taught me," she said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. That no matter how deep the wounds, it's always possible to rebuild. It's always possible to love again. And they taught me that true strength isn't in never falling, but in getting up every time life knocks us down. I looked at my daughter with my heart overflowing with pride. How was it possible that from that broken, poisoned, desperate young woman I once was, this strong, conscious woman determined to make the world a better place had been born? Charles followed a different path, inheriting his father's talent for carpentry. He opened his own workshop, specializing in the restoration of antique furniture, a meticulous job that required patience and vision, qualities he inherited from both of us. In 2010, John was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, already at an advanced stage. The doctors gave him 6 months, but my warrior fought for almost 2 years, determined to see Charles graduate from design school. He managed it by a hair. He passed away 3 weeks after the graduation, at home, surrounded by all of us. The pain of losing John was different from all other pains I had experienced in life. It wasn't the sharp pain of betrayal or the physical pain of poisoning. It was a deep pain, a constant emptiness, the absence of someone who had been part of me for more than 3 decades. But there was also gratitude for each shared day, for each built memory, for the love that sustained us through so many storms. In the years that followed, I gradually transferred the administration of the atelier to my trusted assistant, keeping only a few old clients who insisted they only trusted my hands for their special work. I dedicated myself more to family, my children, my 3 grandchildren who arrived over the years, the community we built around us, and I also dedicated myself to a new mission. Inspired by Marianne's career, I began giving talks at community centers and shelters for women victims of domestic violence. I told my story, not to seek sympathy or shock, but to show that there is life after trauma, that it's possible to rebuild even when everything seems lost. If I'm here today, I would say to these women with frightened eyes and bodies marked by abuse, an 83-year-old woman who survived a husband who tried to kill her slowly with poison, who rebuilt her life from scratch, who found true love and created a happy family. If I'm here, any of you can be here too. The journey isn't easy, but it's possible, and you're not alone. Seeing the spark of hope appear in these women's eyes, receiving their tight hugs, hearing weeks later that one of them found the courage to leave home, to report, to start over. There are no words to describe what this means to me. Today, at 83, I look back and see a life that was worth living. A life marked by pain, yes, but also by rebirth, by unlikely victories, by love found in the most unexpected circumstances. The physical pains from those 7 years of poisoning never completely disappeared. On damp days, my joints still protest, reminding me of the poison that once ran through my veins. But these pains are now only distant echoes. A part of my story that doesn't define who I am, but helped shape the woman I became. You must be wondering what happened to Helena Mendoza, the woman for whom Gerald was willing to kill me slowly. For many years, I knew nothing about her. It was as if she had disappeared from the face of the earth after the scandal. Some said she had fled abroad, others that she was hiding on some relative's farm in the countryside. To be honest, I didn't care. I had closed that chapter of my life and moved on. But in 2015, when I had already turned 73, I received an unexpected call that reopened wounds I believed had healed forever. It was a journalist from a major national magazine. She was preparing a special article on crimes of passion that marked small-town America in the 60s and 70s and had found references to my case. My first instinct was to refuse the interview. Why relive that nightmare? Why expose my pain again to satisfy others' curiosity? But Marianne, always sensible, made me see it from another angle. "Mom," she said, "think about how many women might be going through similar situations right now. Your testimony might give someone the courage to ask for help before it's too late." That touched my heart. If my story could save a single life, it would be worth telling it again. I agreed to the interview, on the condition that it be held in my home, with my family present, and that the focus would be on overcoming, not just on the horror of what I lived through. The journalist, Rebecca, was a woman in her 40s, with keen eyes and a gentle manner. She brought a discreet photographer and a recorder. For 3 hours I retold my story. The mysterious pains, the discovery of the poisoning, Gerald's arrest, my escape to Louisville, the rebuilding of my life with John, our children, my work with women victims of violence. When I finished, I noticed Rebecca had teary eyes. She wasn't just a professional collecting a story. There was something personal there, something that touched her deeply. "Mrs. Miller," she said hesitantly, "there's something I discovered during my research for this article. Something you might need to know. I don't know if it's right to tell you, if it will only reopen wounds, but I feel you have the right to know." My heart quickened. What could be so important after so many years? "Helena Mendoza is alive," continued Rebecca. "She lives in a nursing home in Nashville. She has advanced Alzheimer's, rarely has moments of lucidity. But before losing her memory, she gave an interview to a local newspaper confessing her role in your poisoning." I felt the air leave my lungs. Helena, the name I had tried to forget for decades, the woman who, along with Gerald, planned my slow and painful death. "What did she say?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. Rebecca hesitated, looking at Marianne as if asking permission to continue. My daughter nodded, putting her hand on mine in a gesture of support. "She confirmed everything you already knew, the affair with Gerald, the plan to eliminate you slowly. But she revealed something more, something that was never mentioned at the trial." Rebecca paused as if searching for the right words. "Helena claimed that it wasn't her who had the idea of poisoning. According to her, it was Gerald who suggested it first. He had done it before with his first wife." The shock was like a punch to the stomach. First wife? Gerald was never married before me. He was, Mrs. Miller, in Nashville for less than a year. The young woman died of a mysterious illness that doctors couldn't diagnose. No one suspected anything at the time. Months later, he moved to Pine Ridge, where he met you. My mind was spinning. Gerald had been married before, had killed before. I wasn't the first victim, just the first who survived to tell the story. "Why did this never come up during the trial?" asked Charles, who had remained silent until then, but now couldn't hide his indignation. "It was a different time," explained Rebecca. "Records weren't digitized, information didn't circulate like today, and Helena kept this secret until shortly before completely losing her memory." I remained silent, absorbing the impact of that revelation. It wasn't just about me. There was another woman, young like I had been, whose name I didn't even know, who had her life taken by the same man in the same cruel way. A woman who didn't have a Mrs. Clark to help her, a camera to expose the truth, a chance to survive and rebuild her life. "I'd like to visit Helena," I said finally, to the surprise of everyone in the room, including myself. "Is that possible?" Rebecca seemed disconcerted for a moment. "Well, yes, I can check with the nursing home. But Mrs. Miller, she probably won't recognize you or remember anything that happened. The Alzheimer's is at an advanced stage." "It doesn't matter," I replied. "I'm not looking for confrontation or confessions. I just need to see for myself to definitively close this chapter." 2 weeks later, accompanied by Marianne and Rebecca, I entered the Pine Creek nursing home in Nashville. It was a clean, well-kept place with flowering gardens and attentive staff. Helena was in a wheelchair in the solarium, covered by a blanket despite the heat, staring at nothing. I don't know what I expected to feel when seeing that woman who once conspired to kill me. Hatred, fear, triumph at seeing her reduced to that state. But when I approached and saw her empty eyes, her fragile body, I felt only a deep sadness. Not for me, not for what I suffered, but for the futility of it all. 2 lives destroyed, that of Gerald's first wife and mine. For what? For money? For status? For a passion that certainly didn't last? Helena looked at me without seeing me, without any sign of recognition. Her eyes, once so calculating according to Gerald, were now opaque, absent. The nurse said she rarely spoke, that she spent her days like this, lost in a world only she knew. "Helena," I said softly, sitting beside her. "It's Eleanor." There was no reaction, no movement of recognition, no spark in her eyes, just emptiness. "I came to say I forgive you," I continued, the words coming spontaneously. "Not for your sake. You probably don't even understand what I'm saying now, but for mine, to be able to move on completely in peace." I touched her wrinkled hand, cold despite the heat of the day. For an instant, so brief that later I wondered if I had imagined it, her fingers closed slightly over mine. Then they returned to being motionless. I left the nursing home with a strange feeling of conclusion, as if a book that had been open for decades had finally been closed. On the way back to Louisville, I told Marianne and Rebecca about the other thing I discovered during that visit, something the nurse revealed when I asked how long Helena had been there. "You know what's most ironic?" I said. "Helena has been in that nursing home for 15 years. You know who pays her expenses?" Both shook their heads, curious. "Her nephew, her brother's son, the only relative she has left. The same Helena who conspired to kill her brother-in-law, who got the inheritance when he died, now depends on her nephew's charity. All the money she inherited, which was one of the motives for wanting to get rid of me, is gone. She lost everything in bad investments and fraudulent schemes. In the end, nothing remained of everything she and Gerald planned." There was a lesson there, a kind of poetic justice that didn't come from courts or prisons, but from life itself, following its relentless course. Rebecca's article was published 2 months later, occupying 8 pages of the magazine. It was honest without sensationalism, focusing as much on the horror of what I lived through as on the strength I found to start over. The photos showed me as I am now, a white-haired lady surrounded by children and grandchildren in the garden of the house I built with John. But they also included archive images: me when young, Gerald, the house in Pine Ridge, the bottle of poison presented at the trial. The impact was greater than any of us could have predicted. In the days following the publication, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. They were women from all over the country, of all ages. Some victims of domestic violence, others who had recognized signs of abuse in their relationships thanks to my story. Some simply touched by what they read and wanting to express solidarity. A week after publication, Rebecca called me, emotional. "Mrs. Miller, I need to tell you something incredible. A woman from Portland contacted the editorial office after reading your story. She's going through something very similar. Unexplained pains for years, doctors saying it's psychological, a husband who's always present when she takes medicines. After reading about you, she became suspicious and installed hidden cameras. She caught her husband putting something in her food. He was arrested yesterday." I cried when I heard that. A life saved. A woman who wouldn't have to go through what I went through, who could save herself before it was too late, thanks to my story. At that moment, all the pain, all the exposure, all the discomfort of reliving the past, it was all worth it. In the following months, I was invited to television programs, to lectures at universities and events about domestic violence. I always refused TV appearances. I never liked the spotlight, but I accepted some invitations to speak directly to women who needed to hear that there was hope beyond abuse. At one of these talks, in a community center in a peripheral neighborhood of Louisville, a young woman of no more than 20 approached me after my speech. She had a frightened look, her hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Miller," she said so softly that I had to lean in to hear. "How did you know? How were you certain it wasn't your imagination, that you really were being poisoned?" I looked into the eyes of that girl and saw the fear, the doubt, the confusion that had once been my constant companions. I saw myself decades ago questioning my own sanity because everyone around me said I was making things up. I took her hands in mine, as John had done with me so many years ago, and said the words she needed to hear. "Trust your body, my dear. It knows when something is wrong, even when everyone says otherwise, and you're not alone. We'll help you discover the truth, whatever it may be." That young woman, Amy, was indeed being poisoned, not by her husband or boyfriend, but by her own mother, who was putting small doses of rat poison in her food. A case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, the psychiatrists explained later. The mother poisoned the daughter to then care for her, receiving attention and sympathy for her devotion. Amy was just the first of many. Over the years, my story became a beacon for women in similar situations. I was invited to help create protocols for hospitals, guiding doctors to be alert to signs of intentional poisoning in cases of mysterious illnesses. In 2018, at 76, I received an honor I never imagined. The Eleanor Miller Support Center, a shelter for women victims of violence, was inaugurated in Louisville, a safe place with medical, psychological, and legal support where women could rebuild their lives just as I rebuilt mine. On the day of the inauguration, cutting the red ribbon alongside the mayor and other authorities, I looked back and saw the path I had traveled. From the broken young woman I was to the strong woman I became. From unexplained pains to complete understanding, from near death to living fully. I also saw the faces around me. Marianne, proud and moved. Charles, silently strong like his father. My grandchildren growing up in a world that, although still imperfect, was beginning to listen to women's voices with more attention. I saw the faces of the women sheltered at the center, marked by suffering, yes, but also by the hope of a new beginning. And I thought about all the other women who had passed through my life. My mother, who taught me resilience. Mrs. Clark, who taught me to question. Mrs. Sullivan, who taught me to dream beyond imposed limitations. The young seamstresses I trained at the atelier, the women who listened to my talks, Amy and so many others who found in my story the strength to save their own lives. I also thought about the men. Gerald, who almost destroyed everything but indirectly gave me the strength to rebuild. George, who risked himself to help a stranger. The sheriff who believed me when few did. And especially John, my safe harbor, who taught me that true love heals, protects, and liberates, never hurts or imprisons. At that moment, under the sun of an autumn afternoon in Louisville, while people applauded and cameras recorded the moment, I felt a deep peace. The girl from Pine Ridge, who dreamed of a simple life as a wife and mother, could never have imagined the path she would follow. The pains, the losses, the new beginnings, the unexpected victories. What Gerald didn't understand, what Helena would never understand, is that you cannot destroy someone who refuses to be destroyed. The poison that was meant to kill me ended up strengthening me in ways no one could have foreseen. Each drop that entered my system, causing pain and confusion, also planted a seed of resistance, of determination, of refusal to give up. Today, at 83, I look at the scars I carry, the physical ones that the poison left in my fragile body, and the emotional ones that time helped heal, and I see marks of a battle won. I didn't just survive, I thrived. I didn't just exist. I lived fully, loved deeply, contributed significantly. And if there's a message I'd like to leave with you who are watching now, it's this. No matter how dark the night, how deep the pain, how impossible the path ahead seems, there is hope. There is always a dawn waiting for those who have the courage to continue until the light comes. I am living proof of this. The poison that was supposed to kill me ended up giving me a new life. The pains that seemed without explanation became the source of a strength I never knew I possessed. And the camera I installed to discover the truth not only saved my life that distant night in 1969, but continued to save lives decades later through my shared story. Life is like that. Unpredictable, sometimes cruel, frequently surprising in its ability to transform the worst suffering into the greatest blessing. Everything depends not on what happens to us, but on what we choose to do with what happens. I chose to live. I chose to love again. I chose to transform my pain into purpose. And it's this choice, renewed each morning when I wake up and thank God for one more day that brought me here before you, to share not just a story of horror, but primarily a story of hope. Because that's what we are in the end, not just survivors of life's storms, but navigators who learn to use even the most adverse winds to reach ports we never dreamed of reaching. And before I say goodbye, I'd like to ask all of you who are watching, please leave a like on this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who might need to hear this message of hope. Each subscription, each like, helps this story reach more women who might be going through what I went through. And don't forget to comment which city you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching people from all across America.